Hi, this is Ron Cipcic, and this is the second part in a six-part series where we'll be using aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis to look at macroeconomic issues. In our first segment, we took a look at the Great Depression, and we learned that the Great Depression was basically caused by a contractionary demand shock. And while there's lots of debate about what factors actually precipitated or caused that very severe contraction on the demand side, there's little debate that it was a contractionary demand shock. Now, what we're going to look at in this segment is one view of what should be done when there is a contractionary demand shock. Actually, this particular view will say that nothing should be done. Why? Because the view here, the classical view, is that markets are basically self-correcting mechanisms. So what we're going to look at here is the classical view, and the classical view is basically a pro-market view. And this view goes all the way back to the 1700s with a man named Adam Smith. And Adam Smith was the author of a book called The Wealth of Nations. This seminal work, this pathfinding work, was probably, if you want to trace back economics as a discipline, this book and others that were written around the same time are basically the foundational ideas on which economics is built today. So in a classical view, market systems are believed to be self-correcting mechanisms, and not only that, they're believed to be the optimal system for promoting something called economic growth. And the fact that they are self-correcting mechanisms means that government has very little role to play in them. Now you might say, well, why are they self-correcting mechanisms? Well, the key idea explaining why markets correct and self-correct is the idea that prices and wages are flexible. And we'll see that this is a key idea in understanding different views about the Great Depression and what you should do about a Great Depression or a recession for that matter. And we're going to learn later on, particularly the flexibility of wages is going to be a big idea. Are wages flexible? Particularly do they fall during bad times? We know that workers will generally be happy to take pay increases when there's lots of demand for worker services, that workers are very, 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 very willing to have wage flexibility upward, but the real question will become, do workers accept pay cuts? In other words, are they willing to make wage concessions when economic times are tough? And will employers in fact be willing to cut wages? There's all sorts of problems involved with that. So we'll be taking a look at that a little bit later actually when we look at the Keynesian view. Now, the big idea to pull from here is the idea of a self-correcting mechanism, that markets basically don't need government involvement. So the view is that there will be minimal government involved in macroeconomic matters. Now this view, this classical view, as I said, was very popular as far back as the 1700s. You say, well, gee, 1776, isn't that the year that the Declaration of Independence was written in? Isn't that a time of great political upheaval and a great desire for freedom? And the answer is yes, that there was tremendous political change going on in the world at that time, and that it shouldn't be a surprise that that change would spill over into economic matters. So as citizens of states, or as people desired greater political freedom, they were also really desiring greater economic freedom. And the thing about market systems is you basically leave the seller and the buyer to their own devices. You basically let buyers and sellers decide you let sellers decide what they're going to produce, you let buyers decide what they're going to buy, what they want to pay, and that sort of thing. And so when you entrust your citizens to the point where you basically let your citizens make those choices, you have a great deal of independence. And so we often see market systems associated with democratic systems. You usually will not see truly democratic systems matched together with command systems. truly democratic systems tend to be matched together with market systems because both tend to promote individual choice and individual freedom. Okay, but this is not a course on political science, so I'm going to move on. And you go, well, how does this apply to the Great Depression? Well, this is what we want to look at. Now, let's remember that the Great Depression was a contractionary demand shock. So let me use a different color here. We'll use midnight blue, and let me also get my line feature working here. And so when a contractionary demand shock occurs, the aggregate demand curve slides to the left. Now, we talked in our last video about a number of factors that could cause this. You could be talking about a drop in the money supply due to problems in the banking system. You could be talking about a drop in confidence. You could be talking about a drop in wealth. And as we know, when the Great Depression occurred, early in the Great Depression, the U.S. Congress also enacted trade legislation which depressed our exports. So these are all factors that are generally looked at when we go back and look at this thing called the Great Depression. And you'll notice some of these factors, in fact really all of them except the last one here, all of them were factors that we look at when we looked at the Great Recession, which occurred in 2008-2009. All right, so anything that depresses aggregate demand in a substantial way, in an unexpected way, will shift that aggregate demand curve to the left. Well, what's the effect of that? Well, that's going to push prices lower, as we said in our last segment. That's called deflation, and that will push output lower. And we said, of course, as output goes lower, what happens? Unemployment rises. So here we have deflation, prices are falling, and here we have recession or depression if the output rate drops a lot. And notice that the output rate has fallen below the natural rate. Now again, I remind you that the natural rate of output doesn't change in the short run. So a economy's capacity to produce is assumed to be constant in the short run. We'll learn in a later lesson that YN can move, but that's a long run phenomenon due to things like changes in technology, changes in worker productivity, that sort of thing. So what we're assuming here in the short run is that things like technology and worker productivity and population growth rates and the abundance or lack of abundance of natural resources, those things are basically being held constant. Now, what we want to pick out in this particular lesson is the classical view. The classical view says that when workers are faced with layoffs, when weak business conditions set in and workers are faced with layoffs, they are going to be willing to take wage cuts. In other words, they are going to be willing to cut their pay. So here's what we want to do. We want to read down vertically from point 1 to this new aggregate demand curve, and we'll put a 3 over here. And now what we want to do is we want to shift the aggregate supply curve. I'm going to shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. So this is going to be A. Whoop, sorry about that. Let me clean that up real quickly. If I can get to the right function. And this, we'll call this AS2. Now why did the AS curve shift to the right? Well, this is due to lower wages. Now folks, this is not just a few industries. We're not talking about a few industries taking pay cuts. We're talking about pressure so great in the macro system that workers basically across the board in all sectors are having to be willing to take pay cuts. Okay? Now, of course, some industries would be more affected than other industries, but we're assuming here that this is macroeconomy. This is economy-wide. So what's going to happen here is the aggregate supply curve shifts back to the right. This really decreases the cost of doing business. And that's going to push the aggregate supply curve to the right. This is going to actually create an incentive for greater production. notice that as that aggregate supply curve moves to the right, that prices are going to spiral down even further. So prices are spiraling down even further. But notice the good news is, let's move that up a little bit. The good news is that the output rate begins to return back to or near the natural rate. And here's the idea of a self-correcting system. This was not directed by any government agency. It was not directed by any agency of a few human beings, some sort of economic czar or dictator. This is basically market forces working. And this is the idea of a self-correcting system. Now, classical thinkers and classical economists and classical political thinkers do not argue that their market systems are always rosy and fair. In other words, we're not saying that there aren't difficulties with the economy. What we're saying is that market forces create incentives for the system to move back to or near full employment. And this is the idea. So again, the major idea you want to pull from this is not only are prices flexible, but what we see here in this case is wage flexibility. And this is going to be a key idea, that workers are willing to accept lower wages when faced with layoffs. Now again, we're not talking here about structurally unemployed people, and we're not talking about frictionally unemployed people. We're talking about people who are not able to find work because of weak business conditions. And we're talking about people that would be facing layoffs because of weak business conditions. And so people are able to basically save their jobs if they're employed by taking pay cuts, and people who are not employed are willing to even take lower wages to get into the employment picture. Okay? So this is the classical view. Now, in our next segment, in segment 3, we're going to take a look at a competing view. It's called the Keynesian view. And this is named after John Maynard Keynes. And in segment 3, we'll learn that the Keynesian view hinges on the idea that wages are in fact not flexible downward, that there is wage rigidity, and that in fact this movement in the aggregate supply curve, if it does exist or does take place, it's going to take a long time for it to occur, and in many cases it would just not happen. Okay? All right, so we'll wrap it up here, and I look forward to segment 3.